Hello, this is a video explaining the features of the market trends, the AQPPS market trends module, where we plugged the Infair community data. By Infair community data, we mean basically all the data that is collected by Infair on airline website or airline APIs. As you can see, if I open the carrier list here, you have a huge list of airlines, close to 400. And you have an even greater list of airport pairs or city pairs that corresponds to most of the markets worldwide. So that's a huge data set indeed. What I need to specify also regarding this data set is that we have all the observation weeks for 2020 represented by all those dots here and the scale here, but we have only a few of them in 2019. So this is just a way of narrowing down a little bit the data set which is used, which is huge, and also having those few price points in 2019 1 year ago will enable us to run year-over-year comparisons. That being said, I have voluntarily narrowed down the data set to 5 airlines in the Middle East. And that includes TK, so it's Etihad, Emirates, Qatar, Oman Air, and Turkish. I've limited my analysis to economy cabin, and also important to note that we are looking only at flights which are bookable for the next 2 months. So we are looking at the 2 next months of departure for every single observation week. So straight away you can see two parts in our dashboard. This top panel in dark blue, where you have the global variation in terms of flights. In here we can read minus 72%, and that corresponds to the difference between the observation week of the 15th of June 2020, which is the last week of June, versus 1 year ago, so the last week of June in 2019. There is an overall drop of minus 72%. And you can see that this drop is kind of split into minus 79 for Emirates, minus 74 for Qatar, minus 67 for Etihad, that you can read directly in the panel. And moving the mouse over, you can see the two other airlines, which are Turkish and Oman Air. And the exact same can be looked at when you look at the second indicator, which is set to this RPIX, and actually I'm going to change it to the price indicator to start with, which is more intuitive. I'm going to come back at the end of this analysis to the RPIX, but let's start with a more simple one, which is the price indicator. So just going back to what I was explaining, you have the overall variation in terms of price here, minus 17, and the differences between the different airlines, with Oman Air, which is increasing its prices, Etihad also, and all the rest are decreasing their prices overall. So that's one first way of looking at this data through this year-to-date tab. And once again, year-to-date means comparing the indicators across the different observation weeks. So that's the indication on the panel, and you can see that on top of having those indicators in the panel, you also have the indicators in the graph. And the graph represents well, the same indicators, flights on the left and prices on the right. flights are represented in an area chart form, which is this gray area which is dropping here in March due to the crisis, and that's the bumpy road since March up to end of June. And the prices are represented through a line which is also kind of going down, and then it's kind of chaotic since a few months. So that's the view which is aggregated, at least in the graph, which is aggregated for all carriers. You do have the ability to see the very same split that you have on the top panel. You can also have it in the graph. By default, the dimension is hidden. See here we have hide both dimension, by both we mean the flights and the prices, but you can choose to unhide either the one, the other, or both. So if I unhide both of them, I just need to select the dash here, and now for every single airline I'm going to have a color code, and I'm going to have a layer, and I'm going to have a line. So it could appear a bit messy, but it's very representative of first the market share, or let's say the number of bookable flights share per airline, where we see that Emirates, Qatar, and Turkish have greater number of bookable flights than Oman Air and Etihad. And interestingly, we can see also that since the crisis, Turkish tends to have, or has more flights, bookable flights, than the other airlines. In terms of price, we can see that it's kind of chaotic, except for Turkish over the last weeks of observation. Now, what could be interesting is to narrow even more down the analysis, and instead of looking at the 2 months out, we're going to look at only the 2 weeks out. So instead of I'm going to untick all the observation weeks after the 2 weeks out. So now I'm going to look at only 2 weeks out, and let's see what we have. Okay. So interestingly, when going down to 2 weeks out, we see a pattern which is very, very similar for all airlines now. Turkish is not anymore an exception. They have a very similar pattern than the others, which tends to show that they might leave flights open for sale, but they might cancel the flight a few weeks before departure. So that's an interesting insight. What we can look at also in this year-to-date tab is the ability to change the timeline. We had here in the timeline the observation weeks. We could perfectly look at the a higher granularity to observation months or observation quarters. Let me move to observation months, but as we have very little data for 2019, I'm going to concentrate on 2020, and to do so I'm going to change multiple filters and parameters. So we do recommend to pause. Why? Because if you do one modification, it will recompute. It will take a few seconds to recompute. So if you do 10 changes, it's going to take 10 times more than pausing and then resuming. So I'm going to resume. I'm going to pause. I'm going to choose the granularity of the months. I'm going to choose the last month versus 5 months before. I'm gonna look at only the selected range of observation dates. So I select in the observation weeks filter only the selected range. And for the rest, I'm going to change the area chart into a bar chart. Actually, that's an interesting feature the first indicator, which is in our case flights for the time being, represented on this left axis, can be shown either in the area chart, bar chart, or line chart. Whenever you aggregate by months, it's more readable and relevant to use bar chart, so I'm going to choose the bar chart. Just as a comment, the indicator on the right is always shown as a line. So I think that I'm fine on the different changes I wanted to make. So now I just need to resume, and it's gonna recompute all my dashboard based on my new setup. Okay, so here we go. Now every single bar chart represents an observation month, so January, February, March, and those little tiny ones, April, May, and June. And the same for the lines. There is no change except that all those price points represent averages by observation months. Okay, so that's about it for the explanations around this year-to-date tab. Now let's move to another view, which is called the year-over-year view. This one could be also very interesting to understand the way airlines are trying to recover, the different strategies every single airlines have. So let's open the year-over-year tab. Okay, so that's our year-over-year tab. We still have our 5 airlines selected. And we see the differences between the airlines in the top panel, in the blue top panel, just like before. The difference is that now in the graph, in the x-axis, we don't have anymore the timeline of the observation dates, but we have now the timeline as a form of departure weeks. And the charts represents what was observed in dark blue here, the last June of 2019, last week of June in 2019, and the last week of June in 2020 in light blue. So area charts are still flights and lines are still prices. And very quickly, when you look at all the 5 airlines gathered as a whole, we can see the difference between the number of bookable flights last year for departures in, let's start to look at June and July, July and August, sorry. We can see that in July there are very limited flights versus last year. Then it's increasing in August, and then it's increasing even more in September to go back to a similar pattern than last year. So basically the output or the finding looking only at flight is when you look at overall those 5 airlines, they tend to increase their flights and number of flights in July, and then August, and then reach a kind of normal level in September. That's the observation for the flights. In terms of prices, it's also interesting to see that the dark blue line here, which represents 2019, is always above the light blue line in 2020, meaning that prices overall are lower in 2020 than last year, at least until for departures until end of August. After, it's the opposite. It's slightly more expensive this year than last year. Okay, but that's just bear in mind that this is a view which is gathering all those 5 airlines. The intent could be to precisely see the difference between the airlines, but one by one. To do so, there is a first option is to unhide the dimension, just like we did in the previous dashboard. So if I do that, I will end up with, of course, all my dimensions, but as you can see, it's a bit messy because now I have 2 lines and 2 layers for every single airline. So maybe it could be better to only look at 2 airlines at a time. So let's do that. I'm going to select Etihad and let's say Qatar, and I'm going to apply. So now instead of having 5 multiplied by 2, so 10 lines and 10 layers, I'm going to have only 4 lines and 4 layers. Let's see what we have and how it looks like. So here we go. Now we have only 4 layers and 4 lines. It's a slightly more readable, but still not exactly as clear as I wanted. So let me show you something that could help you in visualizing both or comparing 2 airlines at a time. And that could be done using the split screen feature. The split screen feature can be used or can be enabled through that top left button here. So I'm going to split the screen in 2, and instead of having only one dashboard, I'm going to have 2 dashboards that could be the same or that could be different. In our case, I'm going to select I'm going to select the exact same dashboard. So I'm going to open on the left the same dashboard that I have now on the right. And while the one on the left loads, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select only one airline on the right. Let's say that I'm going to select Qatar on the right. And I will be selecting Etihad on the left, but previous selecting Qatar on the left. I'm going to open the correct setup. Okay, so now I have my 2 airlines, Etihad on the left and Qatar on the right, with this exact same setup. Let's analyze first Etihad. So Etihad here, looking at flights first, we see that there is a huge ramp up in July to end up with a very significant, almost the same than last year, number of bookable flights starting from beginning of August. So that's the first finding for Etihad. In terms of price, we can see that 2020 prices in light blue, the line blue line here, is always above 2019, meaning that overall prices are higher for Etihad in 2020 than 2019, and that's also, of course, represented by this plus 14%. On the right, I have Qatar with a very different finding. Starting from the observation, the bookable flights, I can see that there is also an increase in July, but it's in stages. I have a first increase in July, August, and then September. So it's not as significant and quick than Etihad. It's on different phases. And we see that they reach a similar level of bookable flights only in September or October. In terms of price, it's also very different. Why? Because first of all, we have an overall decrease in terms of price, which we can see here globally, -8%, and this drop can also be seen looking at those lines, with the light blue line being below the dark blue one from 2019 for most of the departures in the coming weeks until September, except for the next 2 weeks of departure, and then it's more or less the same than last year. So it's a very different pattern and strategy for those 2 airlines. If we want to narrow down a little bit more, we're gonna look at a more specific region set. We're gonna look at only the regions from Europe to Asia. And to do so, you have the ability to either use the IATA pair region and select Europe to South Asia and Europe to Southern Asia, or you have the ability to do exactly the same using the from to filters. At the end of the day, it's exactly the same result, so it's really up to you to choose the one or the other method depending on the setup you want to make. So now we have the pattern updated for Qatar, and we can see that more or less there is no difference between the previous pattern. Still the recovery in stages, and still prices that are dropping down. And the same will actually applies for Etihad. The pattern is more or less the same, both in terms of ramp up and in terms of prices. So that's how you can play with the year-over-year tab. And the very same thing that we mentioned in the previous tab. You can also run month-over-months comparisons, or quarter-over-quarter. So that's exactly the same principle than the other dashboard. Let me finish my explanations with the quadrant view, and to look at the quadrant view. Actually, the quadrant view is meant to have a better insight whenever you choose a given dimension. So let me pick the country of origin dimension, just for the sake of this explanation. And while I am doing that, I'm gonna unsplit my screen just to focus on one single dashboard. So I'm gonna click again on this icon, and I'm gonna hide the left part of it. Okay, so I end up with my example with Qatar, my setup with Qatar. And the only thing I have added in my setup is the dimension country of origin. So you can see two things. Something we've seen at the beginning of the video with the top three variation, positive and negative, for each indicator, and that you can see directly in the top bar. And you can see also the dimension in the graph. Well, in an obvious manner, as we have many country of origins, it's super messy to display the dimension in the graph. So in that case, I would suggest to hide both dimensions again, in order to have a more cleaner view on your analysis. Okay, so that's more readable, and now you can compare in a more in an easier way 2019 and 2020, at least in the graph. But my point is to focus on the dimension. Why? Because as we have precisely many dimensions, and we do have first start of information with the top three on the top bar, and when you move the mouse over, you're going to have slightly more detailed information with the top 10, but still we are missing some information. So if you want to have more information precisely, you need to move to the quadrant view, and to move to the quadrant view, just click on any given percentage, and that will redirect you to the quadrant view. So we wait a few seconds. And here we go. We now have the exact same setup, the same values in the top bar, of course, but the difference is the graph, which is turned into two quadrant growth views, one for flights and one for prices on the right. So it's kind of intuitive. If we look at prices first, every dot corresponds to a dimension, in our case country of origin. The x-axis represents the last observed value, and in our case we can see that the higher number of bookable flights come from the country of origin UK for Qatar, and the y-axis represents the growth, either positive or negative. In our case it's negative, and we see that the drop is close to minus 40% from the UK. And every single dot can be analyzed in the very same way. And with no surprise, in this very specific case, most of the countries of origin are going down. The same analysis could be done on the prices, where we see that overall there is also a drop for Qatar, for most of the countries, except from Bulgaria, which is mainly flat, and Poland, which is increasing. And actually, clicking on Poland, you can see that Poland is increasing its price, but it's also one of the two that it's also slightly increasing in terms of flights for some reason. But the whole idea of this quadrant view is to kind of have a better visibility on a given dimension whenever you have a large number of items behind this dimension, which is the case for the countries of origin. Last tip on this one is here we are displaying all the dimensions by default, but you could typically look at only the top 10, which kind of could be interesting if you have too many of them. And here you go. You have the top 10 positive and negative variation in this view. To finish with my explanations, I'm going to go back to the year-to-date tab. So I can show you the other indicators that we have on top of prices and flights. So I kind of stick with my Qatar example here. I have the exact same setup, but the idea will be to instead of looking at flights and prices, to change the indicators. So first of all, let me go through the list of indicators. We have seen flights and prices because that are the two main ones, or the two most intuitive ones. We have also departure date, which is slightly more aggregated than the flights. So instead of looking at bookable departure dates, we are looking at bookable departure dates instead of flights. And here below prices, you have 5 other indicators that are meant to be more normalized. Let me go through a few of them, and I'm going to select the price X first. The price X is simply an indicator which is taking the price and dividing the price by the distance, either in kilometer or nautical miles, depending on what you want to look at. And now, instead of having an overall price, we have a price in that case of 77 USD cents, which represents the price per nautical mile for Qatar, based on the setup that we have. So this could be interesting. Why? Because it's a more normalized indicator, which is kind of not directly related to the markets, but to the markets divided by the distance. In the same spirit, we have an indicator which is called the RPI-X, which is meant to not estimate, but to replicate the same calculation logic than the RASK or the RASM or the yield, meaning taking the overall revenues that are estimated divided by the capacity distance. So that's something that could be also interesting for you to look at. And in our case here, we see that this RPIX for Qatar is estimated at 5 USD cents. And you can see, of course, the variation of this indicator through this line. So, in a nutshell, PRIX, ASI, which is meant to estimate the capacity, TSI, which is meant to estimate the demand, RPI, the revenues, and RPIX, the revenue per distance capacity, are indicators that are more sophisticated than the first ones, but that could be very useful if you want to look at more normalized indicators. If you want to have further information on those indicators and on all the rest of the features that are in this dashboard, you can look at the help pages. Clicking on the market trends here, you have a PDF that you can download where you have all the explanations, and in particular you have the explanation on all the indicators that we have been through in this short video. To conclude, do not hesitate to send us an email if you have any question or any doubt on the way to use the dashboard at support@air-cube.com. Thank you for your attention, and talk to you very soon for a more interactive discussion.